3:16 is probably the most misunderstood verse in the entire New Testament. The only one that really challenges it I've went through before, and that's Ephesians 2:8. So it's really a contest between the two. What I would say, what I can confidently say is John chapter 3 is probably the most misunderstood chapter in the entire New Testament, because there are several verses in that chapter which are thoroughly misconstrued and run amok with by easy believers, free grace fools, Calvitards, other evangelical saboteurs. Okay. And I speak as an evangelical myself, so I have the right to criticize them. Some of you may not understand what I'm talking about, easy believers, free grace. Okay, these are people who have been telling us that all we need to do to go to heaven is just believe the story, that old story. You know, the one about Jesus dying on the cross, coming back to life and ascending into heaven. If we believe that, if we make a faith commitment to its truth, well, we're in like Flint. That's all we ever had to do. Turns out it's a bit more complicated than that, and they don't want to hear it. Well, a big source of the mischief, as I've been harping on throughout this series, is the mistranslation of the verb pisteuo, translated reflexively as believe in our New Testament, and again in John 3:15, 16, 18, 36, throughout John. So it's a problem, and a problem I hope to address here. Again, this whole series has been dedicated to debunking spurious proof texts, and among the most spurious, among the most tear-sowing and damage-doing is John 3:16. Well, tonight I've decided I'm going to correct some people out there. Now, a lot of them are not going to want to hear it, but after this video, they'll be without excuse. All right, so let me get to it. I've got some slides again, but I have to help out those who don't have 30, 40 minutes, whatever it's going to be to get through my slides. Let me cut to the chase. I understand not everybody has the time to spend with me. So let me cut to the chase. Those of you who do have the time, you'll see how I got to my conclusion. But I'm going to give the conclusion for those who only have a few minutes on YouTube. And the conclusion is this word that gets translated believe is actually talking about giving allegiance. There is nothing to believe in John 3:16. The gospel as we know it hasn't happened yet, but it has. The first two chapters have been talking about who the Messiah is, who is the king of Israel, the long promised king of Israel. That's what John's gospel has been focusing on up to the point where we get to chapter 3. And Jesus is speaking to a Pharisee known as Nicodemus. So, again, if you don't have time to go beyond that, you have the takeaway. Jesus is saying that those who give allegiance to him, the Son of God, the Messiah, they are who will have everlasting life. He's not asking for credence. He's asking and demanding allegiance, as he has a right to. Now, for those of you who don't believe me, let's get to my slides. You'll see. Some of you will still not believe me even afterwards, but again, you'll be without excuse. Stand by. As I said, it's a real contest between John 3:16 and Ephesians 2:8 for the New Testament's most misunderstood verse. If there's such a title as the New Testament's most misunderstood verse, the two top contenders are John 3:16 and Ephesians 2. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, lest any man should boast. Yes, thanks. I finally recalled it. Yeah, that again is the most one of the most misunderstood verses, clearly. It's in the first place, it's not talking about salvation from hell. It's talking about salvation from estrangement from God, being rescued from their estrangement from God. And the faith is not, it's not a verb talking about trust. It's a noun talking about faithfulness. And it was the Son of God's faithfulness, not the Ephesians. Now you can, I have a link here in the video description, a link for the entire series. And I think Ephesians 2:8 might have been the first one I did. I forget now. But there's a link to the whole series. I got a whole bunch of these videos about misunderstood verses. And Ephesians 2:8 competes with John 3:16 for the most misunderstood. John 3:16, however, is probably the most famous. Nobody is hanging Ephesians 2:8 at the stadiums. They are hanging signs with John 3:16 at many events. And you'll see people walk in front of live newscasts holding a sign, John 3:16. They believed the gospel is very succinctly contained in this one verse. And so the way to get the gospel out as quickly and as efficiently as possible is John 3:16. Unfortunately, most of these people hanging these banners everywhere, holding up these signs, simply say John 3:16, don't understand what John 3:16 means. Well, today I'm going to show it to them. I kind of doubt most will really care, but again, they'll be without excuse. Let's get to it. All right, one of the most striking things about John's gospel, and by the way, I believe John's was the first gospel. One of the second century church fathers who compiled, one of the earliest compilers of the New Testament, or the canon, what we consider the canon, he claimed it was the fourth gospel. For all we know, he's simply talking about the fourth gospel in a particular collection. I believe it's the first gospel because he evinces no familiarity with the other three, which have been around for decades if he's writing last. And that's pretty strange, especially someone that well connected to the church. So he also writes as if the temple cult was a problem in the present. John's gospel doesn't talk about the Pharisees as if they were already gone, which, according to some New Testament scholars who late date John's gospel to the last quarter of the first century, that by that time, the temple cult, the Jewish temple cult, which crucified Jesus, they're already gone. But John speaks about the Jewish temple cult in his gospel as if they're a problem, and right now. So I believe John's gospel is first. And but one thing that does jump out at you is the use of this verb that gets translated believe in John's gospel. And so the question begs, why is there so much skepticism in John's gospel? And I may point out here, in the KJV's translation of the Gospel of John, and let's face it, that's, for some of you, that's the only translation you trust. In their translation, the English verb believe appears 85 times in John's gospel. We see the English verb believe 85 times. Okay, it's an additional 7 times in John's first epistle, and that's just 5 chapters long. By comparison, believe occurs just 8 times in Matthew's gospel, 11 times in Luke's, and both of those, Luke's and Matthew's, they're longer than John. And Mark, the KJV translators, they needed to believe 15 times. So that's a small fraction of what it is in John's gospel. In the KJV's translation of the entire Old Testament, believe was used only 43 times. That's barely more than half of John's gospel. And the Old Testament is 33 times the size of John's gospel. So we have this verb believe 85 times in John's gospel, more than Matthew, Mark, and Luke combined by a lot, and almost double the entire Old Testament. So my question is, what is the skepticism that John is worried about that he has to use this verb believe all the time? You know what? This statistic here, the 85 times John has to use believe in his gospel, that should make your hackles stand up. That should raise your eyebrows. That should tell you that perhaps the verb that gets translated believe might have been played fast and loose with, which in fact it was. Also in John 3:16. Moving on here, I've got a total of 17 slides here. Not as nearly as long as the last one. I'm going to try and get through them rather quickly because I have to go out myself tonight. All right, so if you've watched any of my videos before, you know this noun appears in almost every one of them, and it's an important noun. It gets translated faith, and we've all been trained since the first weeks at Sunday school to think faith is about trust and mental activity. Actually, it's a noun, not a verb, and it is talking about fidelity, or it's talking about confidence. Confidence is not a verb either. Confidence is the result of verbs. Confidence is when you come to a conclusion about something, okay? It's also means fidelity. Matthew 23:23, Romans 3:3, I think it's Titus 3:1. I could be corrected on that one. Galatians 5:22. This noun gets translated faithfulness. It's the same noun. And arguably, it should have been translated faithfulness many more times than it was. But it wasn't for the same reason that they played fast and loose with the verb, pisteuo. All right, let me move on to that. This is the verb we're going to be looking at in John 3:16. Pisteuo gets translated believe. Always gets translated believe, or trust, or anything. It has to do with credence, invariably. However, it is the action of the noun pistis. And as I just showed you a minute ago, pistis includes the denotation faithfulness, fidelity. This verb is the action of faithfulness, the action of fidelity. And what is that? Obedience, loyalty, keeping faith, not having, but keeping faith, being honest with. This is the action of that noun pistis. And yet it is reflexively translated to make us think it's always talking about credence. Now, why do you suppose Protestant rebels translating in the 1500s against the law to be translating in the 1500s? Why do you suppose these Protestant rebels would be loath to translate this particular verb, allegiance or obedience? You really need to fast and pray to come up with the answer to that one. Moving along. This is an important preposition. And this is the last of the words that I'm going to show you here, the Greek words. I'm not going to wear you out with them as I have perhaps in other videos. This is the last Koine word we're looking at here. We looked at pistis, faith or fidelity, pisteuo, the verb, the action of pistis. And this is the preposition, which we always find very close near either faith or belief. And that's ice. All right, it's pronounced ice. It means to or into. And it gets translated in, like short for into, gets translated upon, towards, for, among. Like so many Koine words, it has a large semantic range. It did all kinds of duty. Like so many Koine words, context determines how you translate it. Unless you're a Protestant rebel and you need it to mean something regardless of the context. All right, the first use of believe in John, and we're going to go through a couple places here till I get to John 3:16. I want to show you how this verb is used in John's gospel and why it's probably not talking about credence in most of its uses. Okay, so let's have a look at the first time John whips out, the first of 85 times we see this verb pisteuo. All right, it's in the first chapter, of course. And verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Talking about John the Baptist, not himself. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. Put that down for a moment. He came to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. Again, this is John chapter 1, verse 6. All might believe. Believe what? Believe what? John doesn't say. But you already have a good idea what it is he's talking about believing, because you were taught what to believe. But John doesn't say it in the first chapter. In fact, he doesn't say it anywhere. But you've been taught to think, believe the gospel is what he's talking about. We return to it. So we're continuing on in the chapter, a few verses below that. John says he, talking about Jesus, the true light, came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God. To all who believed in his name. Believed what? Believe what? This is John chapter 1. There's nothing yet to believe. But if this verb, which got translated believed, pisteuo, if this verb, which as I said a few minutes ago, it's the action of the noun pistis, a noun which includes the denotation faithfulness, if this is talking about giving allegiance, and if this preposition, which I showed you here, means to, then verse 12 should read like this. But to all who received him, who gave allegiance to his name, he gave power to become children of God. Listen to that again. But to all who received him, who gave allegiance to his name, he gave power to become children of God. I'm asking you, which one? Which one makes more sense? Gave allegiance to his name or believed in his name? What does believed in his name even mean in John chapter 1? What does it mean today? No. Gave allegiance to his name. That is another possible translation of this verb pisteuo. But the Protestant rebels didn't want to go there. All right, moving along here. Wow, I'm already halfway through my slides here. Okay. Again, this is what I'm asking you. What exactly does believe in his name mean? The text does not say. Phrases like believed in his name, believes in him, or simply believes, these are never explained in John's gospel, or the epistle for that matter. The exact content of the belief always has to be eisegeted into these passages. It's not there. You're not seeing the content of the belief. You're eisegeting it into it from what you already know. As I observe here, nothing at all needs to be eisegeted into the text if the G4100 verbs, pisteuo, okay, Again, this is the action of faithfulness. If the verbs pisteuo means gives allegiance, and if the nearby prepositions mean with or to, prepositions like en and eis, ice, okay, they get translated many different ways. I'm going to show you in a minute. If the nearby prepositions mean with or to, and if pisteuo verbs mean gives allegiance, there is nothing to be eisegeted into the text. But there's plenty to be eisegeted if the hopelessly vague subjective English preposition in, which is what we see, by the way, everywhere, especially in Ephesians 1. If we choose to translate these prepositions that way, then it gets very vague, doesn't it? It gets very subjective. But not so if we use with or to. All right, you'll see what I mean if we continue. All right, at the end of chapter 1, we get a very clear picture of what believe should have been translated, what it should mean, what this gospel is talking about here in these first 2 chapters before we get to chapter 3. I'm going to go through the story very quickly, familiar to a lot of you here. This is one of the disciples, Nathaniel, how he becomes a disciple of Jesus. And it says in verse 47 of John chapter 1, when Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." And Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" And Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." And Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these." I want you to look a little closer at this verse 50. Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree?" Put that down. Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I saw you under the fig tree?" We hear that and we say, "Believe the gospel because I saw you under the fig tree." Isn't that what we are adding all the time in our minds? You believe the gospel? But do we see the gospel in John 1:50? No, we don't. Do you believe because I saw you under the fig tree? No. Do you give faith because I saw you under the fig tree? How do we know it's give faith and not believe? Let's look at verse 49. Bring this back up again here. I get my blood boiling again here. As us Irish are likely to do. Let me bring this up with a share. Come on, share. Don't get lame on me now. Thank you. And here it is, and share. All right. Yes, by the way, as Irish love to get into these type of arguments. There's an old saying, a fight not joined is a fight not enjoyed. So, I hope you've enjoyed the series. Getting back to it now, verse 49, Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Okay, so if Nathanael is saying Jesus is the King, wouldn't that imply that Nathanael would have to give allegiance, bow his knee to the King? And Jesus answered, "Do you believe?" No. "Do you give allegiance because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree?" We know from verse 49, he's calling Jesus the King. And this same verb says, "Do you believe?" but doesn't add what the content of the belief is. Why doesn't it say, "Do you believe the gospel? Do you believe I am God's son? Do you believe I'm going to save you from your sin problem?" None of that is added. Why? Because this verb is a mistranslation. This verb is not talking about belief. It's talking about allegiance. Do you give allegiance because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? Nathaniel has just called Jesus the King of Israel. Allegiance is what this verb is talking about in John 1:50, and it's what it's talking about in the first three chapters of John, indeed, most of the chapters of John. Okay, let's go on. You'll see what I'm talking about. Another example, next chapter, 2:11. Jesus did this, turn water into fine wine. Remember the story of Jesus turning wine at the wedding, turning the water into wine? He turns water into fine wine. And Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee. Notice after the word in, you see the green en. Okay, this is the preposition, the koine preposition. They went with in. It has different ways it could be translated. In this context, they went with in. It could have, in other contexts, been translated with, by. Even here, at would have been a perfectly appropriate translation of the koine preposition en. They went with in this particular verse. That's okay. I'm not objecting to that. What I'm trying to do is show you that this koine preposition that gets translated in almost reflexively, in other contexts, it can mean other things. See, we in English, we have different words in, on, at, by, with. Koine only had the en, so you had to figure it out. If you're a translator, you're figuring it out by the context, or you're deciding what it should mean according to your own soteriology. Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory. And his disciples believed in him. Jesus turns the water into wine, a miracle, and his disciples believed in him. Again, what does that mean? Let me put this down again. Jesus turns the water into wine in Cana of Galilee, and his disciples believed in him. Believed what? That he's a magician? That he's a wine bibber? What is there to believe? You don't see the content of the belief in John 2:11. Just like multiple other times in John. Again, his gospel uses this verb 85 times, 10 times as often as Matthew for some reason. Does he have in John's world, is everybody a skeptic? No. It's because this verb, pisteuo, that got translated believe reflexively in John's gospel, doesn't mean believe. It doesn't mean believe in John 2:11. It means they gave allegiance to him. That's what it means in John 2:11. His disciples saw his power and they gave allegiance to him. There was nothing to believe. There was no gospel to believe in John 2:11. There's no gospel to believe in John 3:16 either. It's talking about allegiance. Let me go back to it. Moving a little further down the chapter here, John 2:23, when he, Jesus, was in, and again, I don't want to wear you out with this preposition that gets transliterated en, all right? But again, you'll see why it's important in the next chapter. There are different ways it can be translated, just like the other one, EIS, can be translated different ways. Here in John 2:23, it's translated in. It could have been at. It's fine. It's not important right here. I just want you to see that there are multiple ways to translate this particular preposition, this key preposition in John chapter 3. And here they translated in. That's fine. Okay. When he was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival. Again, it's the same preposition that gets translated during. Could have been translated on the Passover. When he was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the signs that he was doing. Once again, this phrase, believed in his name. Really, what exactly did they believe? Because of the signs he was doing? So again, are they believing this is Jesus the magician? Jesus the prophet? What are they believing here? Many believed in his name. No. The more natural translation is many gave allegiance to his name. Again, look at the preposition eis, E-I-S here. To or into. They shortened it into in. Many believed into his name. Well, what would that mean? If you want to literally translate E-I-S here, it would be into. So many believed into his, or many believed to. No, obviously it's talking about they were giving allegiance to his name because of the miracles they saw him doing. They believed that he was indeed the Messiah. That's what John's gospel has been all about here. Who's the Messiah? And let me move it one step ahead here. All right, so we're coming to the crux now. I'm in the third chapter. The third chapter. So we're going to the immediate context of John 3:16, the two verses that precede. Let's go through it. Now that you have an idea that believe does not necessarily mean believe, and that in does not necessarily mean in, have a look at 3:14 and 3:15, and stay with me here. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. Now, there's that phrase again, believes in him. What does that mean in John chapter 3? Believes in what? He hasn't gone to the cross yet. All right, keep that in mind. In John 3:15, the verse immediately preceding the most famous verse in the entire New Testament, that whoever believes in him, this preposition that gets translated in, in, just as easily with equal lexical justification could have been translated with. Whoever believes with him. They went with believes in him, but believes, again, a dubious translation at best. Believes what? No. He who keeps faith with him. Keeps faith with him may have eternal life. Read this again. Let me read it for you again. And just as Moses, remember Moses in Numbers 21, he lifts up the serpent in the wilderness and it forms a cross. The serpent lifted on the staff, it's a cross. That's what Moses lifted up. So must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever keeps faith with him may have eternal life. There's no confusion with keeps faith with him. But if you say believes in his name, well, then you have to eisegete what the belief is. Okay, once again, in John 3:15, the exact content of the belief is absent. And it must be eisegeted into the text. Nothing at all needs to be eisegeted into John 3:15. If pisteuo means keep faith with, and en, the preposition en, is not in, it's with. Not believing in his name, not believing in him, keeping faith with him. That makes sense. But of course, the Protestant rebels couldn't go with that, could they? Keeping faith with, allegiance, being under the authority of? No, that couldn't work with them. Here, the verse itself, John 3:16. Again, the most misunderstood verse in the entire New Testament, with the possible exception of Ephesians 2:8. which is also part of the series, look for my description in the link. Okay. In the information about this video, you'll see a link to my other videos about Ephesians 2:8, John 5:24, Acts 16:30, 31. There's a handful of some truly misunderstood, spurious proof texts constantly being whipped out by easy believers. We're talking about free grace fools, Calvitards, Lutholaters, everybody who tells you that all you got to do to go to heaven, just believe the old story. Turns out there's something more to it than that. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. You understand why I had to prepare you for this particular verse systematically, these last 12 slides before I got to. You understand now how this can be misunderstood? All right. How John in his gospel has been talking about allegiance, not about credence. And we come up to John 3:16. Once again, the exact content of the belief is absent. You have to eisegete the content of the belief into it. Because he doesn't say everyone who believes in him. What does believes in him mean? Again, John 3:16, he hasn't gone to the cross. Nobody's even talked about him solving your sin problem. All right, this is John 3:16. The question is, who's the Messiah? Who's the King of Israel? Nathaniel has already answered that question in 149. You're the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. That's what this discussion has been about. It's not discussing the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That's many chapters off yet. All right. Nothing at all needs to be eisegeted into John 3:16 if, as in so many other places in John, the pisteuon means gives allegiance. And this preposition EIS means to. Let me read it the way it should have been written. For God so loves the world, so loved the world, and he gave his only son so that everyone who gives allegiance to him may not perish, but may have eternal life. Quite a bit different, isn't it? This is another verse which is almost as well, it's as badly misunderstood as 3:16, not quite as famous. But this is something else that easy believers will throw at you too, John 3:18. Because again, of the mistranslation of the G4100 verb, pisteuo. And it reads like this: those who believe in him. Again, we see this preposition in, which should have been, which really means into. They put in, should be just to. Those who believe in him are not condemned, but those who do not believe are condemned already because they have not believed in the name of the only Son of God. Okay, as I observe here, as in 3:15 and 16, everyone has been trained to think Jesus, or perhaps the evangelist John. In 3:18, he's talking about believing in the gospel. Those who believe. We always add the in the gospel after that. Okay? But the gospel does not appear anywhere in John chapter 3. Those words, evangelion, not there in John chapter 3. They must be dishonestly eisegeted into each of these verses because the gospel, as we understand that term, has not yet happened. It hasn't happened in John chapter 3. There is no gospel as we understand it in John chapter 3. So when you see that word believe, you're thinking those who believe the gospel. No, the gospel isn't in John 3:18. It's not in 3:15 or 16 because it hasn't happened yet. Okay, but again, at the bottom here, I note nothing needs to be eisegeted into this verse if the aspiring King Jesus is discussing allegiance to him in this chapter. All right, that's another allegiance, again, is another possible translation of this verb pisteuo that got translated believes. What is this verb again? As I noted in the beginning, pisteuo, the action of the noun faith. What is the noun faith? Fidelity. What is the action of fidelity? Allegiance, obedience, fidelity. You go here. John 3:36 is the smoking gun vindicating everything I have said here tonight. 36. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever disobeys the Son will not see life, but must endure God's wrath. Whoever believes in, or another possible translation, whoever gives faithful allegiance to the Son has eternal life, but whoever disobeys the Son will not see life, but must endure God's wrath. The wrath of God is on him. All right, so as I observe in 3:36, two opposite actions that produce opposite results are contrasted. All right, one action gives you eternal life, the other one gives you the wrath of God. These two opposite actions are contrasted in John 3:36. But belief is not the opposite of disobedience. Obedience is the opposite of disobedience, obviously. The KJV, dishonestly translated apathon, the word that in John 3:36 gets translated disobeys in some translations. The KJV, in their translation, they rendered this verb, apathon, believeth not. Okay, this is the same verb that they translated do not obey in Romans 2:8, disobedient in Romans 10:21, and obey not in 1 Peter 3:1. The same verb. So why does this verb in the KJV means believes not in John 3:36, but disobedient in Romans 10:21? Why do you suppose they would say believes not? Because, again, as I observe here, two opposite actions are being contrasted with opposite results. One leads to eternal life, the other leads to the wrath of God. They're claiming, as they have throughout the chapter, that this verb, pisteuo, is talking about credence, belief. They don't say what the belief is. The content of the credence is nowhere to be found. They are insisting it's not talking about allegiance, it's talking about credence. Well, here we have this one verse. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life, but whoever disobeys the Son will not see life, but must endure God's wrath. Why would skeptics be under the wrath of God? No, it's those who are disobedient to the authority of the Son. That's why it's talking about allegiance all throughout John. Believes, this verb pisteuo, in John 3:36, it's obviously talking about obedience. And that, if it means that in 3:36, it means the same thing in 3:15, 16, and 18. Move along here. All right, I've got two more slides here. This is one of them. A time-honored rule. This is what I learned, my first hermeneutics course in seminary. The oldest and the surest principle of biblical hermeneutics is that obscure and ambiguous passages, they are to be interpreted using the light provided by the clear and the unambiguous passages. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? If the word means something pretty clearly in this particular context here, let's go with that. That's we know if we're not too sure of the meaning over there, what does it mean where we really know it's what it means over here? We know it's not ambiguous here. It's telling us what it means. We need to use that light if we're not too sure somewhere else. In John 3:36, the verb the Protestant rebels cynically mistranslated believes clearly means obeys. Okay? That's There's no doubt that same verb that gets translated disobeys, except in the KJV where they said believes not. All right. Clearly, it means it's talking about disobedience. Uh, and there's no good lexical, grammatical, contextual reason to include the same verb constructed in the same way, pisteuo. There's no good reason to believe it's going to mean something in John 3:15, 16, and 18 that it doesn't mean in 3:36. It's the same word. The same word in 3:36 is the same word in 3:16. It means obedience in 3:36 very clearly. There's no reason to think it's going to mean credence in 3:16 or 15 for that matter, or 18. We know it clearly means obedience in 3:36. No good reason to believe it means credence in 3:15, especially when there's nothing to believe and there is no content of the belief anywhere in the near context. You have to eisegete that credence in, that belief. It's not there. It's not there because it's not talking about credence. It's talking about allegiance to King Jesus, the Messiah, the long-awaited Messiah. That's what John's gospel is about. This is the correct translation. For God did so love the world that his Son, the only begotten, he gave that everyone who gives allegiance to him may not perish, but may have life everlasting. As I said from the beginning, this is the most famous and the most misunderstood of the New Testament's verses. Ephesians 2:8 is a close competitor for that title, but it's not as famous as John 3:16. John 3:16 takes the cake as the most famous and the most misunderstood verse in the entire New Testament. Easy believers for the past 500 years have been running us amok by making us think that Jesus was demanding credence in John 3:16. He's not demanding credence. He's demanding allegiance. He's saying that he's the king, he's the Messiah, he's the one who was sent by God, and he's proving it with miracles. His disciples are giving allegiance to him. Others are giving allegiance to him after they've seen his works. That's why he was crucified. He was a threat to the political establishment and the religious establishment. Not about belief in him taking away your sin problem. No, it's about giving allegiance to the King, King Jesus. All right, so I vented my spleen about that one, and now it's time for me to get up and get out of here. But we will be returning with more spurious proof texts. I look forward to reading your feedback. I think we may do one from John's epistle to follow up. I'm thinking perhaps 1 John 5:1, another terribly misunderstood verse. But we'll get to that at that time. And thanks for staying with me this long. I'm glad many of you have enjoyed this series. I appreciate the feedback I'm getting from you. And see you again soon, I hope. Be well.